Hi, friend. This is Alex McRobs, founder of the Mindful Life Practice, and you're listening to the Sober Yoga Girl podcast. I'm a Canadian who moved across the world to the Middle East at age 23, and I never went back. I got sober in 2019, and I now live full-time in Bali, Indonesia. I've made it my mission to help other women around the world stop drinking, start yoga, and change their lives through my online Sober Girls Yoga community. You're not alone, and a sober life can be fun and fulfilling. Let me show you how. Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Sober Yoga Girl podcast. I am so excited to be sitting with Jolene Park today on the show. And Jolene's name has come up from so many people over the years. Like, so many people have done her training course, and it has come up in so many of the bios of people that are in my programs and my courses. And it's kind of cool the way we both ended up getting connected for this interview, and someone else had recommended my name as someone to speak in one of her offerings, and it was almost like the universe aligning us to meet up. And so I'm just so excited to be sitting here today and hear more about Jolene's story and her work, and what she's done in the sober world is just so inspiring. So I'm excited to hear more. So welcome, Jolene. How are you?
Thank you so much. I'm well, and it's just so fun to meet you and connect with you. I love your energy, and like you said, it's the synchronicity of how we've come together, and it's just really fun right now to get to know you and connect with you.
So you are in the States, and I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your life pre-sobriety. Like, what was your drinking like? What kind of community did you grow up in? All that kind of stuff.
Sure. Well, I've said many times that, my drinking story would make a very boring memoir compared to the memoirs that I was reading, like Carolyn Knapp drinking a love story years ago. That was not my story. I was not that type of drinker, just go hard. I couldn't because I would feel so sick. So I loved the initial effect of red wine. That was my drink of choice. But the next day, my blood sugar dropped, and I was just hungover and nauseous and queasy. But I loved the initial effect, so I kept drinking. But I wasn't a hard drinker. I wasn't kind of that fear and loathing in Las Vegas kind of story. So nothing bad happened. Kind of a typical gray area drinker where you wouldn't have looked at me externally when I was drinking saying, oh, she's, really out of control and needs to rein it in. However, it was very easy for me to pour a glass of wine or order a glass of wine thinking I'm just going to have this one glass. But then once I would drink that first glass, have a little bit of a buzz, and I'd say, I'm going to have another, and then I'm going to have another. And it was very easy to have a handful of glasses, which basically the bottle of wine, on a really frequent basis. And then just felt nauseous and sick the next day from drinking a bottle of wine frequently. And that's the extent of it. That really is kind of how I drank. And it was, that's too much. We know by the standards today of what there really is no safe or recommended intake, and more than 7 drinks a week. And I could do that easily in 2 nights. And anything, beyond that over a 7-day period gets to be heavy, risky drinking. So I was certainly in that heavy, risky drinking category. But I was drinking the way many women drink today, and many of my friends around me at the time were drinking as well.
Yeah. And so what was where was the point at which you ended up quitting?
So I quit for good in 2014, and I had quit many times, really the decade leading up to that, kind of over a 10-year period. I was working in wellness. I was teaching corporate wellness classes, traveling around the United States. And because of my background in nutrition, I'm a functional nutritionist and teaching wellness. I flew under the radar when I would stop. because I was doing a paleo challenge. I was doing a 30-day yoga challenge. And so then part of that, it's like, oh, I'm doing these fitness and nutrition challenges. I'm not drinking. And so nobody's antenna went up with that. It's like, oh, of course that makes sense. You're doing this and no alcohol. Like people really, they just didn't question it. And so I would do things like that. Like I said, for really about a 10-year period, I did a yoga training, and for 18 months, I didn't drink. I would do paleo challenges and not drink. And so nobody's eyebrows were raised, but really, quietly what I was doing was saying, I can't keep drinking like this. So I'm going to clean it up and do some yoga or, do something with nutrition. But then I would go a couple of weeks, a couple of months, whatever it was, and say, why I don't need to be so restrictive. Like this doesn't need to be so all or nothing. Like, why am I doing this really restrictive piece? I can be a social drinker. So I'd go back to drinking and quickly go back to the way I was drinking before. So in 2014, after all of that back and forth Groundhog Day, it never changed. It was really clicking of like, this isn't going to change. There was no illusion or delusion for me anymore that this was going to get any different. It was actually just getting worse. Each time I would go back and drink, it seemed to escalate more and more. And so it was just a real kind of come to Jesus truth moment for me of this is it. I don't want to keep repeating this cycle. It's not going to change, and it's certainly not getting better. And so in 2014, it was just, I knew in my bones, I'm done. I'm just not going to do this anymore.
Wow. And so as you describe that, I'm just wondering, because I know your work is gray area drinking. That's what your course is, and that's what you offer. Is that, because I've always wondered, is that what you would describe a gray area drinker? Like someone who's able to stop for a period of time and then goes back? Or would you say, because I was like a daily drinker, but I've always thought to me, oh, maybe that's gray area because I was still functioning and able to have my job and whatever. So how would you define gray area drinking? Is that what you would say?
There's different characteristics. Yeah. One characteristic thread that I see often with many, many clients is that back and forth drinking, where it's having the capacity and ability to stop drinking. So I talk with many people who, they can and do drink a lot, and they can and do stop. And right. And what I mean by that is they're not going through withdrawal symptoms where they're needing to have medical support when they stop drinking. So there's a lot of people who drink a lot of alcohol, and then they're like, I can stop. And they will say the stopping isn't that hard. Again, they're not, other than, maybe the initial hangover in 24 hours, but it's not like a withdrawal period. And even, day in, day out, it's often not a moment to moment like I need a drink. Yeah. But what's hard is staying stopped because of that mental, I'm not that bad. Like, do I need to quit forever? Why does this have to be so all or nothing? That's the harder part with gray area drinkers, more than the physical part. Now with you were saying, you were drinking daily. I would say, my question would be, did you have that capacity and ability? What happened when you did stop physically for you?
I mean, in the time when my drinking was at its worst, I don't think I thought it was possible for me to stop. When I did stop in 2019, when I finally did, I didn't have physical withdrawal symptoms, but I had mental withdrawal symptoms. But I also think I had emotional withdrawal, but I also think that had to do with having a mood disorder. Like, I think it was just my brain chemistry of having the substance gone. But I was really depressed and not in a good headspace when I quit. And so I don't know if that would that be characteristic of someone with gray area drinking?
Why did you think that you couldn't stop?
It's a good question, because it was like a habit. It was like I relied on it for my, my fun, my socializing, to calm me down. It was like a crutch for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And did you take any, well, I guess, I mean, when you stopped, was that the first time that you had taken a period without alcohol, or had
Yeah,
you had other periods where you didn't drink?
that was the first time I had taken a period without alcohol. I mean, if you think, of course, everyone's on this kind of this journey where, when I was younger, I could like I remember a time when I was like 23 and I was living in Kuwait, and I chose a trip for me and my mom where we would stay at a campsite where no alcohol was there for like 3 days, and that was fine. But then all of a sudden, when I was 26 and in the same experience in Morocco, it was like not fine. I needed to have access to alcohol the whole time. And so somewhere along the way, like there were probably times when I was younger when I was sober for like a week or whatever. But yeah, that time in 2019 was the first time that I was ever sober for more than a week, probably.
Yeah. How do you define your drinking? Like, what's the label, if you will, that feels most resonant and comfortable for you in describing how you drank?
That's a good question. I mean, I, I don't think that I really have one.
Yeah.
um, I don't think I really have one. I think I really just define myself post the experience as sober. And for a long time, I actually didn't even like the word sober. I used alcohol free because of all the stigma and all the negativity attached with sobriety. And then it was really when I was starting up my work that I realized that sober girls yoga sounded a lot cooler than alcohol free yoga. And that was when I really embraced the term sobriety and decided that it was really cool and like counterculture and edgy. But definitely in the early days, the word sobriety was not comfortable to me yet.
Yeah. And did you stop on your own, or what? I don't know your stop story.
I did, but I did I joined an online group and I had their support. I was not really using their course stuff so much. Like they would send me videos, I would read the daily emails, but I wasn't really engaging with anything beyond like really the community support.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so it's such an interesting question because and I did this too when I was drinking, because it's like we want to measure and know, like, are we that bad or not that bad? Kind of, hearing other stories. So I kind of shared a bit of how I drank, and then hearing your story, and those listening, there's that desire to kind of to listen to both of us, and then measure and be like, oh well, that's. But I always, with these conversations of some of the specifics of how much and how often and that type of thing, where I like to take the conversation back to is there is no safe or healthy recommended intake level of alcohol. And that's in the Lancet Medical Journal that came out in 2018. And the Canadian studies, they just recently, like they've come out with, there's zero and recommended level. Like it's just from a disease prevention, from an optimal health standpoint. So when we start there, that there is no safe intake, and I'm not a prohibitionist and saying everyone, should stop drinking alcohol. But the truth is, it just doesn't take much to be on the spectrum. And so to your question of kind of, is this gray area drinking or not? Really anything, there's different labels. Some people might define as that they're a social drinker or a moderate drinker or sober curious or a dependent drinker or a problem drinker, alcohol use disorder. All of that technically is under the umbrella of it's in the gray area, because there isn't a safe intake. What is not gray area drinking is once the drinking gets to the point where the person needs medical supervision to detox because of life-threatening issues. Now that is not, it's not a judgment, it's not a moral judgment, it's not any type of judgment. It's just a physiological reality of where is the system, our body system needing support. Where are we on that spectrum? But otherwise, we all have different stories, kind of different factors that come into it, but ultimately it all falls under this umbrella of a gray area.
Awesome. Thank you so much for explaining that. And I like that differentiation that you just made, because I think that's really important, especially like I also do work in sobriety, and that is when someone needs a medical intervention, or when they need support beyond what I can offer. And there's some people who, what I offer in sort of this safe, sober, curious yoga space works with a lot of people. And then there's some people that come through and I'm like, you really should be in a more rigorous, structured program like AA that has more strict, steps and expectations and meetings. And that might be the right route for you. And so I think having just sort of that distinction of, the medical intervention or basically what beyond we can offer as coaches.
Right. Yeah, it's really important. And I train coaches, and it's where we start with the training of that assessment of who's coming to us. Are they in the gray area? And there's a way to assess that. And we want to do that to stay in our scope of practice.
Yeah.
Just the professional liability, legal side of this. This is a big deal. Alcohol is very addictive, and it can be life-threatening. And so we really want to be in the scope of where people are on the spectrum. And again, it's no judgment. It's not a hierarchy of, somebody's over here versus here. It's literally, I work so much with physiology. So we want to assess and know where the physiology is and what level of support the physiology is. It's not a psychological weakness. It's supporting the body because, alcohol can be very destructive, and there can be physical symptoms that at times need that medical support.
Right. So tell me more about, so you became sober. How did you end up starting doing the work you're doing? Like, tell me about that journey.
Well, I didn't start talking about not drinking until about 18 months, 12 to 18 months into not drinking. So I was quiet about it. My drinking was quiet as far as, because a lot of my drinking was on my own. So at home, alone at night, watching Netflix, I lived alone. I worked and traveled alone. I was teaching corporate wellness classes. And so it was, the expense account, the corporate expense account after I would teach all day. I loved my work. I loved wellness, but would then drink, alone, go out to the restaurant and things. So that I was quiet about how I drank like that. But then when I quit, I was also quiet about it. But about a year and a half into not drinking, I started speaking more. I did a podcast interview, and because I was listening to, do you know Holly Whitaker and Laura McCowan?
Yeah.
So I was listening to their podcast in 2016 and wrote to them and said, I love what you're doing. I love how you're having a different conversation about this topic. But I think there's this missing piece, which is this physiological piece, the brain chemistry, working with the physiology. And I just thought my email would fall to the bottom of the inbox. But Holly replied and said, this is great. We'd love to hear more. Will you come on the podcast? And so that was my first entry about really speaking publicly. And I didn't look at it as like a business strategy at the time. I really had no idea how many people felt the same way. It just never occurred to me, even when I was drinking. That I just thought, like many people do, it's like everybody else is drinking, like it's not bothering them. And the truth is we just don't talk about it. And so once I started talking about it, what happened was my inbox started filling up with women saying, that's my story. Your story is my story. This is how I drink. Like I function. My partner, my friends tell me that I don't have a problem. When I say I'm thinking about stopping, they're like, you're worrying about it too much. And so once I started sharing my story about a year into not drinking, organically, this coaching business then started developing because people were coming to me saying, tell me more. I'm interested in this physiology. I'm interested in the brain chemistry. Will you coach me? So I kind of hurry up and, built the plane as I was flying of putting together a coaching method and started working one-on-one with people.
Amazing. Wow. That is so cool. And then at what point did you go into like running the coaching courses? Because now that's like a huge part of what you do.
Right. So I started coaching individuals in 2016 and I started training coaches in 2018. So I coached full time for 2 years. And then it was the same organic piece that started happening was then coaches were coming to me saying, and a lot of my clients were coaches and social workers and therapists in the healthcare industry and would coach with me and really liked the process and now weren't drinking and saying, look, I'm a therapist, I'm a coach. I'm passionate about not drinking now. I identify as a gray area drinker. I want to do with my clients what you just took me through, but I don't feel confident doing it because it's not technically what I'm trained in. With my general coaching or as a therapist, will you teach me what you just did? So same thing, people just started coming and started putting together and curating and developing this training course, which I'm this is the 5th year now. Is that right? 18, 19, 21, 6th year of teaching coaches and practitioners how to work with gray area drinkers.
That's so amazing. And what I love about your story is that it just seems like it's one of those examples of like when you step into what you're supposed to be doing, the path just kind of opens up in front of you, like it just seems like everything is like, obviously you like worked really hard to set it in motion, but I just mean like the way organically, you're all of a sudden you're on Holly Whitaker's podcast and Laura McGowan's podcast, and all of a sudden, people are asking you for coach training. And it's really cool how sort of if you open yourself up to that possibility, I think your purpose will kind of appear.
Absolutely. And I know that that's a bit of the work you do with the entrepreneurial side. There's that energetic side. And I would say that's more of my organic business story than I've never had a marketing plan. I've never kind of done, okay, here's my strategic funnel. Here's my,
that's incredible.
And, it probably could have benefited to have that. But I just built it, in motion as the demand was there and people were asking for it. But I certainly did not quit drinking thinking this is going to be a business. That was zero, thought in my mind. It just happened. But I do feel like, there's this piece that I was born to give voice to, and it's part of what I'm here to do. And I didn't have that traditional kind of marketing business plan around it.
That's so inspiring. So amazing. So where do you see your work going from here? Like, where do you hope to sort of expand your work in the future?
Well, I'm really passionate about the training and the education side of it. So that is my foundation. It's my roots, the corporate training. I love facilitating training programs, writing, designing, and taking a group through a training education process of like, what's the how, what's the what, like, how do we practically kind of put these pieces into play? Because stuff can, we hear it, we listen to it, we read it, and then it's Thursday and we haven't done anything. Right. So that's my real passion of putting it in practical kind of layman's terms, but particularly for the healthcare industry. So that's where I want to continue to grow, continue to train practitioners. I think it's a missing link. I think there's a component that looks at, big alcohol and marketing, how we're marketed to. And yes, I think that's a piece. But I think another piece that's the white elephant in the room is that, and clients tell me this, and I've had the same experience too, is when we're drinking, we go to our doctor, we go to our therapist. There's a misnomer out there that people aren't as revealing and don't tell the truth to their practitioner. And being in the trenches, working with people, I would argue that that's not necessarily true. I think people do say, here's what I'm drinking. I'm concerned. That was exactly what I said to my doctor. I said, my anxiety's up and I'm drinking more than I know I should. But often what happens when we say that is the practitioner, the coach, whoever, they're drinking themselves and aren't equipped to they're like, what do I say here? And we'll quickly brush it aside. It's like, oh, it's not like you're an alcoholic or anything. You're just a little stressed, everything in moderation, a little bit of red wine is good for your heart. And it's very confusing to problem drinkers, gray area drinkers, because internally they know there's that struggle. They're waking up at 3 a.m. saying, I can't drink like this anymore. And then a practitioner's quickly brushing it aside saying, don't worry. And so that's where my passion is that the healthcare industry, the healthcare practitioners and coaches need training on this and need some of their own support, because that's a big industry that's absolutely drinking in the gray area. Most of my clients over the years have been therapists, coaches, doctors, nurses, social workers, because it's if there's that compassion fatigue and the soothing and needing to discharge and replenish. And if that hasn't been taught or modeled or built in, it's very easy for that industry, the people on the front lines, to be soothing, regulating, and discharging at the end of the day with alcohol. And so that's where my work is, and where I want to do even more work with that industry.
That's so interesting that you say that, because when you said that, I actually just had a flashback to when I was probably 18 or 19, and it was my first time ever going into counseling. And I remember saying to my counselor how much I drank. I remember saying to her that I'm partying, like I'm binge drinking like 4 nights a week. And she said to me, that's normal for students your age at university. And it's so interesting, because I feel like I've carried so much blame of like I wasn't really telling my doctors or counselors. And I think as my drinking accelerated even more and more, I would downplay it. But I definitely remember the first time I went into counseling saying that clearly. And so that's really interesting the way you bring that up, because it's just, and it's so true. What we've learned about it, or what I've learned about it, is that often we don't even realize that we're kind of projecting our own things when we're talking to people about stuff like this. And so, I would have friends who would tell me that they wanted to take a break from drinking when I was a drinker, and I would try to convince them to drink with me because I was just projecting my own stuff, And so yeah, that's a huge area that I agree with you really needs training and focus, so that it doesn't mean that all healthcare providers have to be sober, but so they can realize, step out of their own personal biases and be able to support someone who is a gray area drinker, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I cannot tell you how common that is. So if we bring this up just like this, if we were in a room with, sober, curious, gray area drinkers, as you and I both are, 9 times out of 10, everybody in that room is going to have the exact story. I hear it all the time when I post this notion about talking to a therapist or a doctor on Instagram, and which I've done many times over the years. The comments just fill up with exactly what you shared. When I talk with clients one-on-one, everybody has a story of actually saying that. And again, it's a real myth out there that people lie, air quote, about their alcohol. They're forthcoming. The problem is that the practitioner, the therapist, the doctor brush it aside. And then I think, it sets people up to drink potentially for like another decade, where in that moment, if the conversation were different, and people also say this, they'll say, I wish my doctor, my therapist, my coach would have just said, yeah, there's no doubt you're drinking too much. People want that health of person outside of them to validate and to have a little tough love and say, this is too much alcohol. You're drinking too much. And that's where that training, it's the white elephant in the room that needs to change. So I'm not saying all practitioners now need to become gray area drinking coaches, but they need to be trained and need to be educated on this and need their own support when they're drinking in the gray area, because many are. And that's why it's hard for them to say yes to their clients, you're drinking too much, because they're saying it to themselves as well.
So interesting. Yeah. So I have I'll have a couple more questions for you. Just the first is, if anyone listening to this wants to find you and work with you, what offerings do you have right now? How can people connect with you?
So grayareadrinkers.com is my website where all the info is. My TED Talk is up, my podcast, Editing Our Drinking and Our Lives. People can go back to that archive. It's all about gray area drinking. I've got some programs, the Sober Choice, that takes you through a self-paced 30 days of quitting drinking. And then I train coaches. So that program is the Nourish Method. And people can submit an application for that. And I enroll a couple times a year for that training, but it's all on grayareadrinkers.com.
Amazing. And my last question for you is, if someone listening to this would like some, if you would like to offer any wisdom or any advice to someone that was listening to this who's curious about stopping their drinking, doesn't know how to get started, what advice would you give?
Well, stop and notice what happens next. So that's the neuroscience. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book "The Body Keeps the Score." That's one of his famous phrases. Notice what happens next. So when you don't drink alcohol for a couple days, a couple weeks, notice. And I can say for myself personally, and working with hundreds of clients, a lot can shift in a really positive way in 30 days. But hearing me say that is just, it's like through the cognitive brain, but experiencing it is different. So give yourself that gift, that opportunity to notice and just see what you do notice. But as far as I guess what you're saying, just kind of advice on if they're in that back and forth or wanting to stop, is that?
Yeah. And stop and notice is great. A great starting point. I love that.
And then, I just, again, my work is very physiologically based. So working with the brain, boosting brain chemicals, balancing blood sugar, working with the gut microbiome, because there's more, that's where more of the neurotransmitters are manufactured in our gut more than our brain. So it's that second brain piece, working to calm the alarm part of the brain, which is that amygdala, the animal brain, the primal brain. So, I mean, all of that can sound like kind of some big science, but it's actually very, very practical, just working with the body, eating regularly, keeping blood sugar balanced. So, doing some of these, going back to the basics, are you hungry? Are you tired? Are you hydrated? And it can sound like, oh, well, that's really simple and that's not really sexy and glamorous. But I find over and over, again, working with people through the years, that when we go back to the basics, it can make an 80% difference in a really positive way. So notice what happens when you don't drink alcohol, but then notice also when you add in some of the basics of just getting sleep, eating protein, eating on a regular basis, staying hydrated, and then continue to notice what happens. Because when you're regulated and the body's in that homeostatic state, that's what we're trying to do when we drink alcohol. So, using some of these basic wellness, lifestyle, nutrition pieces, they really can pay a lot of dividends.
Amazing. Well, Jolene, thank you so much. It was so amazing to finally meet you and hear your story. And it's just really inspiring what you've built and the way that you've impacted and touched so many people around the world. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I'll see you soon.
Yes, you will. Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
Hi, friend. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Sober Yoga Girl podcast. This community wouldn't exist without you here, so thank you. It would be massively helpful if you could subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast so it can reach more people. If we haven't met yet in real life, please come get your 1-week free trial of the Sober Girls Yoga membership and see what we're all about. Sending you love and light wherever you are in the world.